Picture the amber glow of gaslight cutting through prairie dust, the discordant melody of a calliope drifting across parched fields. In the autumn of 1891, the arrival of Silas Marlowe's Grand Carnival of Curiosities promised salvation to drought-starved Midwest towns. But what townsfolk discovered in whispered confessions after the flames died down was that patrons who entered Marlowe's carnival never truly left. They vanished from records, their belongings sold, their names forgotten. Yet, according to a carnival doctor's ledger, according to a preacher's final sermon, these missing souls became part of the show itself, in the most nauseating literal way imaginable. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I'm about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The secret lay not in the disappearances, but in what the carnival did with the vanished. They became an ingredient, a proprietary seasoning that made the carnival's roasted meats irresistible, addictive, craved by entire communities who unknowingly developed a taste for human flesh. This was not just crime. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades. And when it ended, the people mourned not for victims, but for the flavor they would never taste again. The allegations sound like the fevered imaginings of a madman, yet they emerge from sources too numerous, too consistent, to dismiss as mere folklore. In the final weeks of 1891, as autumn winds swept across the barren plains of what would later be called the Dust Bowl, witnesses claimed that Silas Marlowe's traveling carnival had perfected the most grotesque enterprise in American history. The carnival's signature attraction was not its games of chance or its exhibition of curiosities, but its food stalls. Patrons traveled for miles to taste what carnival barkers promised was the finest roasted meat west of the Mississippi. The aroma, witnesses swore, was unlike anything they had ever encountered, rich and complex, with an underlying sweetness that made their mouths water from blocks away. Men who had sworn off red meat found themselves queuing twice in one evening. Women who prided themselves on home cooking admitted they could never replicate such flavor. What no one suspected, according to the disputed testimony that would later surface, was the source of this irresistible taste. The meat itself appeared conventional enough, beef and pork carved from recognizable cuts. But the seasoning, the proprietary blend that Marlowe's head butcher applied with religious devotion, contained an ingredient that transformed ordinary flesh into something addictive, something that created a craving so powerful it drove customers to return night after night. The ingredient, investigators would later claim, was derived from the carnival's missing patrons themselves. Consider the case of Thomas Whitmore, a traveling salesman who visited the carnival in Hope's End during the summer of 1890. According to the town barber who shaved him that morning, Whitmore expressed excitement about joining the carnival as a performer. He was seen entering the carnival grounds just after sunset. His horse and wagon were found abandoned 3 days later, but Whitmore himself had vanished without trace. The official explanation recorded in the town ledger was that he had simply moved on, as traveling men often did. But according to a water-stained note later discovered by investigators on the very night of Whitmore's disappearance, the carnival's meat began to carry a new depth of flavor that patrons found utterly irresistible. The correlation was not isolated. Time and again, the pattern repeated itself across 3 counties, across 2 devastating years. The carnival, witnesses would eventually testify, was not simply hiding its crimes. It was serving them, one plate at a time, to an unknowing public that developed an insatiable appetite for the evidence of murder. But to understand how such a monstrous operation could function undetected, we must first understand the world that was hungry enough to sustain it. The Great Dry Spell of 1889 through 1891 transformed the American Midwest into a wasteland of cracked earth and abandoned dreams. What had once been fertile prairie now stretched endlessly under a merciless sun. The soil split into geometric patterns of despair. Wells ran dry. Crops withered in fields that resembled graveyards more than farmland. Entire communities packed their belongings into wagons and fled eastward, leaving behind ghost towns where dust devils danced through empty streets. It was into this landscape of economic collapse and spiritual desolation that Silas Marlowe's Grand Carnival of Curiosities made its calculated appearances. The carnival's route, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed, targeted the most vulnerable settlements, those places where hope had grown as scarce as rainfall. Towns like Proctor's Folly, where the population had dwindled from 800 souls to fewer than 200. Villages like Verdant, whose ironic name now mocked residents who had not seen green grass in 18 months. Settlements like Hope's End, where the very name seemed to prophesy doom. These communities, isolated by distance and devastated by drought, shared certain characteristics that made them ideal hunting grounds. Their populations were transient, swelled by drifters seeking work that no longer existed, diminished by families abandoning homesteads they could no longer sustain. Record-keeping had grown haphazard as town clerks departed and official positions went unfilled. Most critically, the residents had grown accustomed to unexplained departures, to neighbors vanishing in the night without farewell or forwarding address. The carnival exploited this social chaos with surgical precision. It arrived during the hottest months, when desperation peaked, when even the most devout questioned divine providence. Its colorful banners and cheerful music created a stark contrast to the surrounding desolation, offering not merely entertainment, but psychological rescue from the grinding reality of survival. For communities that had not experienced joy in months, that had forgotten the taste of abundance, the carnival represented a miracle. Local newspapers from the period, those few that continued publication, recorded the carnival's arrivals with an enthusiasm bordering on religious fervor. The Proctor's Folly Gazette declared Marlowe's show a beacon of civilization in our darkest hour. The Verdant Weekly called it proof that beauty and wonder can flourish even in our blighted land. These publications, desperate for advertising revenue and positive news, rarely questioned the carnival's business practices or investigated the curious fact that its food supplies seemed inexhaustible despite the regional famine. The drought had created perfect conditions for predation, a landscape where human life held diminished value and where questions were rarely asked about those who simply disappeared. Into this world of dust and dreams rolled the one spot of color and abundance that would exploit the community's hunger in ways they could never have imagined. At the apex of this mobile enterprise stood Silas Marlowe himself, a figure whose very presence seemed to bend reality around his will. Contemporary accounts describe a man of medium height but commanding bearing, possessed of the kind of magnetic charisma that could convince a farmer to part with his last dollar for a glimpse behind a velvet curtain. Marlowe spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. He dressed impeccably despite the dust and grime of constant travel, his black suits always pressed, his silver watch chain always gleaming, as if the harsh realities of prairie life simply refused to touch him. Beneath Marlowe operated a carefully structured hierarchy of specialists, each essential to the carnival's dark machinery. Malcolm "Mutton Chop" Henderson served as head butcher and overseer of the food operations, a hulking man whose perpetually grease-stained apron had long since abandoned any pretense of cleanliness. Malcolm possessed the dead eyes of a man who had witnessed too much slaughter, whether of animals or otherwise. His knife work was legendary among the carnival folk, precise cuts delivered with mechanical efficiency that never varied regardless of what lay on his cutting board. Dr. Cornelius Hargrave maintained the carnival's official records with obsessive precision, documenting every transaction, every patron interaction, every employee departure in his leather-bound ledgers. A small, fastidious man who had allegedly practiced medicine before joining Marlowe's enterprise, Hargrave treated documentation as sacred ritual. His entries contained elaborate codes that disguised the true nature of the carnival's activities, transforming murder into mundane business transactions through careful euphemism and misdirection. The carnival's most tragic figure was Annabel Lee, billed as the Living Mermaid and displayed nightly in a glass tank filled with murky water. What audiences did not realize was that Annabel had been rendered mute by a procedure that severed her vocal cords, ensuring her silence about the horrors she witnessed from her aquatic prison. Her tank positioned her to observe the carnival's hidden operations, making her an unwilling chronicler of disappearances she could never report. Communication came only through desperate notes, slipped to sympathetic visitors when guards looked away. Lizzie Hawkeye Crow commanded the carnival's shooting gallery with unmatched skill, but her true value lay in talent scouting. Her friendly demeanor and impressive marksmanship drew crowds, allowing her to identify potential marks, those isolated souls whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation. Years of this work had hollowed her conscience, leaving her trapped between complicity and horror at what her recruitment had enabled. The carnival operated under ironclad rules of discretion. Employment contracts contained unusual clauses about maintaining absolute silence regarding internal operations, with violations carrying unspecified but dire consequences. New employees underwent a gradual indoctrination process that normalized increasingly disturbing activities through incremental exposure. Those who expressed moral qualms simply vanished, their departure explained as voluntary resignation. This closed world operated with mechanical precision for over 2 years, until the first crack appeared, not from external pressure but from within its own carefully maintained facade of normalcy. The first crack in the carnival's facade appeared in the form of Peter Whispering Pete Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose fondness for whiskey had earned him both his nickname and the town's dismissive tolerance. Pete worked odd jobs when sober enough to function, swept floors at Murphy's Saloon in exchange for drinks, and generally existed on the margins of Proctor's Folly's already marginal society. His opinions carried no weight. His observations were dismissed as alcohol-fueled fantasies, and his eventual disappearance surprised no one, which made his final pronouncement all the more chilling in retrospect. On the evening of September 13, 1890, Pete stumbled into Murphy's Saloon, clutching a half-eaten plate of carnival beef, his weathered face pale with an emotion that transcended his usual intoxication. The other patrons initially assumed he had simply overindulged in both alcohol and food, a common occurrence that typically resulted in predictable consequences. But Pete's behavior that night defied explanation. He set the plate on the bar with trembling hands, staring at the remaining meat with an expression of profound horror. When Murphy asked what troubled him, Pete's response silenced the entire saloon. He claimed the beef tasted familiar, uncomfortably familiar, in a way that made his stomach turn not from nausea, but from recognition. He insisted the flavor reminded him of something he had encountered during the war, something he refused to elaborate upon, but which had clearly left permanent scars on his psyche. The other patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances. Pete had served in the Union Army during some of the conflict's bloodiest campaigns, experiences that had contributed to his descent into alcoholism. Veterans occasionally suffered episodes where past traumas surfaced unexpectedly, manifesting in confused rambling about battles long concluded. Murphy poured Pete another drink and suggested he was simply exhausted from too much carnival excitement. But Pete would not be consoled. He continued to stare at the meat, occasionally prodding it with his fork as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. He muttered about textures and seasonings, about flavors that should not exist in any respectable establishment. Most disturbingly, he claimed the taste had awakened cravings he thought the war had buried forever, desires that civilized men were never meant to experience. The saloon's patrons grew increasingly uncomfortable as Pete's monologue continued. They had come to drink away their own troubles, not confront the ravings of a traumatized veteran whose grip on reality had always been tenuous. Eventually, Murphy convinced Pete to take his accusations elsewhere, suggesting he discuss his concerns with the carnival management if the food had truly upset him. Pete left the saloon clutching his plate, muttering promises to get to the bottom of this business. He was last seen walking toward the carnival grounds, his unsteady gait illuminated by the gas lamps that marked the midway. By morning, both Pete and his accusations had vanished, leaving behind only whispered speculation that gradually faded into tavern folklore. The official explanation, recorded by the town clerk 3 days later, noted that Peter Kowalski had departed Proctor's Folly to seek employment opportunities elsewhere. His few possessions were sold to cover outstanding debts, and his name was struck from the municipal rolls. It was an easy story to accept, a convenient conclusion to an uncomfortable episode. But it would not be the last time someone questioned the true nature of the carnival's signature cuisine. The carnival's true genius lay not in its crimes but in its marketing. Silas Marlowe understood that desperation creates opportunity, that people starved for hope will embrace any promise of transformation, no matter how unlikely. His beautifully illustrated posters appeared in every settlement weeks before the carnival's arrival, plastered on general store windows, nailed to church bulletin boards, distributed by advance men who spoke with evangelical fervor about the wonders awaiting those brave enough to seize their destiny. "A new life of wonder awaits," proclaimed the largest banner, beneath illustrations of exotic performers and mysterious attractions that defied conventional explanation. But it was the smaller text that proved most seductive to the carnival's intended victims, seeking individuals of exceptional character for permanent positions within our traveling family. No experience necessary, training provided, new identity guaranteed. To communities devastated by drought and economic collapse, such promises represented salvation. The carnival specifically targeted those whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation, individuals whose social connections had been severed by circumstance or choice, widows whose children had moved east seeking opportunity, drifters following rumors of work that never materialized, veterans haunted by memories they could not escape, young men fleeing family obligations or legal troubles. The recruitment process began with seemingly innocent conversations, initiated by carnival employees who mingled with crowds during performances. These talent scouts possessed an uncanny ability to identify vulnerability, to recognize the particular brand of desperation that made individuals susceptible to promises of reinvention. They spoke of adventure, of escape from the grinding monotony of failed farms and abandoned dreams. Most importantly, they offered immediate solutions to pressing problems, whether debt, loneliness, or the weight of a reputation that could never be rehabilitated. But what makes this story truly fascinating is how it reveals something darker about human nature itself. Before we continue with how these recruitment efforts played out, take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with transformation, with the promises that tempt us to abandon everything familiar. Subscribe if you're curious about the truths that history tried to bury, because what happened next exposes appetites we prefer not to acknowledge. The carnival's new life pitch proved irresistible to those who had already lost everything worth preserving. Employment contracts were drawn up in ornate script on official-looking parchment, complete with elaborate seals and legal terminology that suggested legitimacy while obscuring actual obligations. The documents promised room and board, steady wages, and most seductively, complete anonymity for those seeking to escape their past. What the contracts did not specify was the nature of the work itself, the duration of employment, or the precise methods by which anonymity would be achieved. These omissions were carefully calculated, designed to exploit the psychological state of individuals so desperate for change that they would sign anything offering hope of escape from their current circumstances. The signing ceremony took place in Marlowe's private wagon, a richly appointed space that suggested prosperity and respectability. New recruits were offered celebratory drinks to mark their transition into the carnival family, toasts to their courage in embracing opportunity when others clung to familiar misery. The alcohol was specially prepared to ensure that the celebration would be their last conscious memory of voluntary participation in their own fate. For some, the promise of a new life was fulfilled in the most literal, most horrifying way imaginable. What happened after the contracts were signed reveals a level of systematic brutality that challenges comprehension. The carnival's operation functioned with industrial efficiency, transforming human beings into commercial product through a process so methodical it resembled a perverted assembly line more than random violence. The unconscious recruits were transported under cover of darkness to what appeared to be the carnival's most innocent attraction, the Tunnel of Love. This romantic facade concealed the carnival's true heart, a mechanized abattoir hidden within the tunnel's twisting passages. The gentle boat ride that couples enjoyed during daylight hours followed a different route entirely from the midnight processions that fed the carnival's insatiable appetite. Malcolm Henderson oversaw this hidden operation with the same professional detachment he had once applied to legitimate butchering. His workspace, concealed behind false walls that muffled sound and contained odors, contained industrial equipment that had been modified for purposes no manufacturer had ever intended. Steam-powered bone saws operated with mechanical precision. Rendering vats bubbled constantly, their contents heated by coal furnaces that burned throughout the night. The entire system was designed for maximum efficiency and minimal waste. Dr. Hargrave meticulously documented each stage of the process in his coded ledgers, recording weights, yield ratios, and quality assessments with scientific precision. His entries treated human processing as routine inventory management, using euphemisms that transformed murder into mundane business transactions. Merchandise received replaced abduction. Processing complete disguised dismemberment. Product prepared for distribution concealed the final transformation of human flesh into culinary ingredients. The creation of the carnival's signature seasoning represented the operation's most diabolical innovation. The savory salt that made the carnival's food irresistible was not simply human flesh ground fine, but a complex blend that included bone meal, organ extracts, and rendered fat, all carefully processed to create a powder that could be applied to conventional meat without revealing its true nature. The recipe, known only to Malcolm and Marlowe himself, required precise ratios and specific preparation techniques that maximized both flavor and psychological impact. The seasoning's addictive properties were not accidental but carefully engineered. Malcolm had discovered through experimentation that certain combinations of human-derived ingredients created cravings that conventional spices could never satisfy. Patrons who tasted food prepared with savory salt found themselves returning compulsively, driven by appetites they could neither understand nor control. The carnival had created not just a method of disposal, but a system of psychological enslavement that guaranteed customer loyalty. The operation's scope was staggering. Bills of lading discovered years later revealed orders for salt and conventional spices in quantities far exceeding any legitimate carnival's needs, suggesting that the human-derived seasoning was diluted with common ingredients to extend its supply and mask its true nature. The carnival served hundreds of meals each night, meaning that dozens of communities unknowingly participated in cannibalistic consumption on an unprecedented scale. Most disturbing was the operation's sustainability. The carnival's reputation for exceptional food quality ensured a steady stream of customers, while its recruitment promises guaranteed a renewable supply of raw material. The system fed on itself, using the profits from serving human flesh to attract more victims whose remains would satisfy future appetites. This grotesque machinery operated flawlessly for over 2 years, leaving behind only a lingering aromatic trail and the conspicuous absence of those who had sought new lives within the carnival's embrace. The first crack in the carnival's perfect facade emerged from an unexpected source: guilt. Lizzie Hawkeye Crow had spent 18 months identifying suitable recruits for Marlowe's operation, her keen eye for human desperation making her invaluable to the carnival's procurement process. But by the autumn of 1891, the weight of her complicity had begun to consume her conscience in ways that threatened the entire enterprise. Lizzie's shooting gallery occupied a prime position along the midway, its bright banners and challenging targets drawing crowds throughout each evening's festivities. Her remarkable marksmanship served as both entertainment and psychological assessment tool as she engaged patrons in conversations designed to evaluate their suitability for recruitment. Those who revealed isolation, financial desperation, or estrangement from family received her most charming attention, along with invitations to discuss exciting employment opportunities after the show concluded. For months, this system had functioned without complication. Lizzie would identify promising candidates, introduce them to Dr. Hargrave for preliminary interviews, and collect her commission when new contracts were signed. She convinced herself that the recruits had simply moved on to other carnival locations, that their silence resulted from the demanding schedule of traveling performers rather than anything more sinister. But the disappearance of John Simple Jack Heston shattered her willful ignorance in ways she could not rationalize away. Simple Jack was not his real name, merely the cruel designation applied by townspeople who mistook developmental disability for stupidity. In reality, Jack possessed the gentle nature and trusting disposition that made him beloved by children and protective adults alike. His grandfather, Old Man Heston, had raised him since childhood, providing the structure and supervision that allowed Jack to function within the community despite his limitations. When Jack expressed fascination with the carnival's exotic attractions, Lizzie saw an opportunity for easy recruitment. His obvious vulnerability, combined with his grandfather's advanced age, suggested minimal investigation would follow his departure. She engaged him in extended conversations about joining the carnival family, painting vivid pictures of adventure and acceptance that appealed to his romantic imagination. The contract signing proceeded according to established procedure. Jack's excitement about his new life made him an enthusiastic participant in the celebratory toast, eagerly consuming the specially prepared drink that would ensure his compliance. Lizzie watched him lose consciousness with the satisfaction of another successful recruitment, another commission earned through professional competence. But Old Man Heston's response defied all expectations. Rather than accepting his grandson's departure as inevitable, the elderly man launched a relentless campaign to locate the missing boy. He questioned every carnival employee, examined every attraction, demanded explanations for Jack's sudden disappearance that grew increasingly difficult to provide. His persistent inquiries attracted attention from other townspeople, including Deputy Thorne, whose professional instincts had been aroused by the pattern of unexplained vanishings. Confronted with the genuine grief of a grandfather searching for his beloved charge, Lizzie experienced a moral crisis that threatened her continued participation in the carnival's activities. The abstract nature of previous recruitments had allowed her to maintain psychological distance from their ultimate fate, but Jack's childlike enthusiasm and Old Man Heston's desperate love made denial impossible. Late one evening, as Deputy Thorne conducted another fruitless search of the carnival grounds, Lizzie made a decision that would ultimately destroy the enterprise she had helped sustain. She slipped him a hastily scrawled note on damp paper, its message cryptic but unmistakably significant. "The smoke from his chimney never smells of wood." The note was brief, anonymous, and carefully ambiguous, but for the first time, Deputy Thorne possessed a thread worth pulling. Deputy Elias Thorne arrived at the carnival grounds on the morning of October 15, 1891, accompanied by Sheriff Miller and armed with official authority to conduct a thorough investigation of the premises. The cryptic note about chimney smoke had haunted his thoughts for 3 sleepless nights, its implications too disturbing to ignore, yet too vague to justify immediate action. Old Man Heston's relentless inquiries about his missing grandson had finally provided the legal pretext necessary for official intervention. The carnival's response to their arrival demonstrated a level of preparation that should have raised immediate suspicion. Rather than expressing surprise or indignation at the unannounced inspection, Silas Marlowe greeted the lawmen with gracious hospitality that bordered on enthusiasm. He personally escorted them through every attraction, explaining operations with the detailed transparency of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from official approval. Malcolm Henderson proved equally cooperative, abandoning his usual gruff demeanor to become an almost chatty guide through the food preparation areas. He offered samples of seasoned meat with the pride of a craftsman displaying his finest work, explaining his smoking techniques and special spice blends with technical expertise that impressed even the skeptical Sheriff Miller. The industrial-sized preparation areas were spotlessly clean, the equipment properly maintained, the storage areas organized with military precision. Dr. Hargrave produced his ledgers without prompting, spreading the leather-bound volumes across a makeshift table with the eagerness of an accountant welcoming an audit. His records appeared comprehensive and meticulously maintained, documenting every financial transaction, every employee contract, every supply purchase with obsessive detail. When questioned about departed employees, he provided reasonable explanations, supported by signed resignation letters and forwarding addresses that appeared genuine upon casual inspection. The search itself unfolded with frustrating efficiency. Every wagon was opened, every storage compartment examined, every potentially concealed space thoroughly investigated. The lawmen found exactly what they were supposed to find: a legitimate traveling entertainment business operating within legal boundaries and maintaining proper documentation. The carnival's cooperation was so complete, their transparency so absolute, that questioning their honesty seemed almost rude. Yet Deputy Thorne could not shake the sensation that he was witnessing a carefully orchestrated performance rather than a genuine investigation. The carnival employees moved with choreographed precision, always appearing exactly where they were needed, always providing answers that satisfied immediate questions while somehow avoiding deeper scrutiny. Their smiles never wavered, their explanations never faltered, their hospitality never felt forced despite its obvious calculation. Most unsettling was the oppressive heat that emanated from the food preparation tent, a stifling atmosphere that made extended examination uncomfortable and encouraged hurried completion of that portion of the search. The air itself seemed thick with the residue of cooking processes that defied identification, a complex mixture of smoke and steam and something indefinable that made breathing difficult and thinking unclear. Sheriff Miller concluded the investigation after 4 hours of fruitless searching, officially recording their findings as negative for any evidence of criminal activity. The carnival's documentation satisfied legal requirements, their operations appeared professionally managed, and their cooperation had exceeded reasonable expectations. In his official correspondence filed 3 days later, Miller noted the thoroughness of their examination and dismissed local rumors as unfounded speculation born of economic anxiety and social prejudice against traveling performers. But Deputy Thorne departed the carnival grounds with his suspicions not only intact, but significantly intensified. The investigation had been too smooth, too perfectly managed, too obviously designed to satisfy official requirements, while revealing nothing of substance. The law had come and gone, conducted its dutiful examination, and found nothing amiss. Yet Thorne remained convinced that the real carnival continued to operate just behind a curtain he had somehow failed to locate. Deputy Thorne's obsession with the carnival's hidden activities transformed him into a man possessed by singular purpose. For 6 days following the official search, he haunted the records office of 3 neighboring counties, cross-referencing missing persons reports with the carnival's documented appearances. What emerged from this painstaking investigation was a pattern so clear, so undeniable, that it challenged his faith in coincidence itself. The correlation was mathematically impossible to dismiss. In every settlement where Marlowe's carnival had established residency for more than 5 days, missing persons reports increased by an average of 300%. The disappearances followed identical patterns: solitary individuals with minimal social connections, people whose absence would generate limited investigation, victims whose departure could be easily explained by economic necessity or personal choice. Thorne's hand-drawn map told the story with brutal clarity. Red pins marked carnival appearances, black pins indicated missing persons reports, and the overlap was virtually complete. Proctor's Folly, 4 disappearances during the carnival's 6-day engagement. Verdant, 5 missing persons during an 8-day residency. Hope's End, 6 vanished individuals corresponding precisely to the carnival's extended stay. The mathematical precision suggested planning rather than opportunity, systematic predation rather than random violence, but correlation, however compelling, remained circumstantial evidence insufficient for legal action. Thorne needed concrete proof, documentation that directly linked the carnival to the disappearances, rather than merely establishing their temporal proximity. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A second anonymous note slipped under his office door during the darkest hours of October 22nd. The message was even more cryptic than the first. Check the ledger codes. D means departed. V means volunteered. Both mean the same thing. The handwriting matched the previous note's nervous script, suggesting the same terrified informant continued to risk exposure in service of justice. But this communication provided specific direction rather than vague hints, pointing Thorne toward evidence that could substantiate his growing suspicions. Obtaining access to Dr. Hargrave's ledgers required delicate maneuvering that tested Thorne's investigative creativity. Direct seizure would require warrants that no judge would sign based on anonymous accusations and statistical correlations. Instead, Thorne employed a strategy of misdirection, visiting the carnival under pretense of following up on routine administrative questions related to their business license renewals. Dr. Hargrave, still confident in the security provided by his elaborate coding system, willingly produced his records for what he assumed would be perfunctory examination. His ledgers represented decades of meticulous documentation, entries that transformed the carnival's criminal enterprise into seemingly mundane business transactions through careful euphemism and systematic obfuscation. The codes were elegantly simple once their meaning became clear. Departed indicated individuals who had been processed through the carnival's hidden machinery, their remains converted into the ingredients that made the carnival's food irresistible. Volunteered marked those who had signed employment contracts before meeting identical fates, their legal consent providing psychological cover for premeditated murder. Both classifications appeared with disturbing frequency, far exceeding normal employee turnover rates for legitimate businesses. More damning were the correlations Thorne discovered between ledger entries and the missing persons reports he had compiled. John Simplejack Heston appeared as J. Heston, volunteered, October 12, in Dr. Hargrave's precise handwriting. Thomas Whitmore, the traveling salesman whose disappearance had first attracted official attention, was recorded as T. Whitmore, departed July 3rd. Every missing person from Thorne's investigation corresponded to a coded entry in the carnival's supposedly legitimate business records. The ledger contained over 200 such entries spanning the carnival's operational period, representing a systematic campaign of murder that dwarfed the most notorious criminal enterprises in American history. Each name represented a life deliberately extinguished, a person transformed from individual human being into commercial product through processes that challenged comprehension. The ledger was irrefutable evidence, but using it meant returning to the carnival with knowledge that would mark him for elimination, and this time they would be waiting. Deputy Thorne returned to the carnival grounds alone on the night of October 28th, armed with evidence that could expose the enterprise but lacking official support that might ensure his survival. The ledger's revelations had proven too disturbing for Sheriff Miller, whose political instincts warned against pursuing accusations that could destroy his career if proven false. Thorne faced the choice between abandoning his investigation or confronting the carnival's secrets without backup, knowing that his previous inquiries had almost certainly marked him as a threat requiring elimination. The carnival after midnight transformed into a landscape of shadows and whispered menace. The cheerful music and bright lights that characterized evening performances had given way to an industrial hum emanating from the food preparation areas, accompanied by rhythmic sounds that resembled machinery more than culinary activity. Thorne bypassed the main entrance, scaling the perimeter fence at its darkest point and moving through the maze of wagons and attractions with the stealth of a man whose life depended on remaining undetected. Following the mysterious chimney smoke mentioned in Lizzie's original note, Thorne navigated toward the source of the mechanical sounds that violated the night's stillness. The trail led him past the Tunnel of Love, whose romantic facade concealed horrors that no daytime visitor could imagine. Behind the attraction's cheerful exterior, concealed by false walls and muffled by layers of insulation, lay the carnival's true heart, an industrial processing facility designed for maximum efficiency and absolute secrecy. The sight that greeted Thorne challenged his capacity for rational thought. Malcolm Henderson worked with methodical precision at a massive butchering table, his cleaver rising and falling in steady rhythm as he processed what appeared to be human remains. Steam rose from enormous rendering vats that bubbled with contents too horrifying to examine closely. The air itself had grown thick with the sweet, nauseating odor of cooking flesh, mixed with exotic spices that failed to mask the underlying stench of death. Scattered throughout the workspace were jars filled with the carnival's signature seasoning, labels reading Marlowe's proprietary savory salt in elegant script that transformed cannibalism into commercial branding. The industrial scale of the operation suggested systematic murder spanning months or years, a business enterprise that treated human lives as renewable resources for a product that had made the carnival legendary throughout the region. Malcolm's awareness of Thorne's presence came without warning or explanation, perhaps triggered by some survival instinct honed through years of violent work. The massive butcher turned with surprising agility, his cleaver still dripping as he assessed this unexpected witness to activities that no outsider was meant to survive. The confrontation that followed was brief but savage, a struggle between trained lawman and experienced killer that tested both men's commitment to their respective causes. Thorne's advantage lay in desperation rather than skill, his knowledge that failure meant not only personal death but continued operation of the carnival's monstrous enterprise. Malcolm fought with the confidence of someone accustomed to overpowering victims, but Thorne's determination proved sufficient to shatter one of the precious salt jars, its contents spilling across the blood-stained floor in a crystalline cascade that represented evidence no court could ignore. The sound of breaking glass triggered chaos throughout the carnival as employees realized their secret had been exposed. Shouts echoed through the night as carnies abandoned their posts and fled toward wagons that could provide escape from the reckoning that now seemed inevitable. The carefully maintained facade of respectability dissolved in minutes, revealing the panic of criminals whose elaborate deception had finally collapsed. In the confusion that followed, fire erupted from sources that were never clearly determined, consuming evidence and spreading through the carnival's wooden structures with suspicious efficiency. The flames illuminated fleeing figures who disappeared into the surrounding darkness, most notably Silas Marlowe himself, whose silhouette vanished into the prairie as if swallowed by the very landscape that had concealed his crimes. By dawn, the carnival existed only as charred remnants and drifting smoke, but the horror was only beginning to reveal its true dimensions through the community's reaction to their loss. In the weeks following the carnival's destruction, Deputy Thorne conducted interviews with townspeople who had witnessed the final confrontation, expecting to find horror and revulsion at the revelations about their beloved entertainment. Instead, he discovered reactions that challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature and transformed his investigation from a simple case of criminal justice into a disturbing exploration of communal complicity. The interviews began conventionally enough. Residents expressed shock at the accusations, disbelief that such horrors could have operated undetected in their midst, and gratitude that the perpetrators had been stopped before claiming additional victims. But as conversations continued and initial politeness gave way to unguarded honesty, a different truth began to emerge from beneath the socially acceptable responses. Mrs. Adelaide Crenshaw, the town's most respected seamstress, began her statement with appropriate condemnation of the carnival's alleged crimes. But when questioned about her personal experiences with the carnival's food, her demeanor shifted in ways that made Thorne profoundly uncomfortable. She spoke of the meat's extraordinary flavor with a wistful longing that seemed inappropriate for someone discussing evidence of cannibalism. Her description grew increasingly detailed, focusing on textures and seasonings with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. Similar patterns emerged from subsequent interviews. Townspeople who should have been horrified by the revelation instead demonstrated a curious nostalgia for what they had lost. They spoke of sleepless nights not because of trauma over the carnival's crimes, but because they craved the unique taste they would never experience again. Several admitted to attempting recreations using conventional spices, experiments that invariably failed to satisfy appetites that had been fundamentally altered by their unknowing participation in cannibalistic consumption. The most disturbing revelation came from Mayor Whitlock himself, who confessed that community leaders had harbored suspicions about the carnival's activities for months before the final confrontation. Strange odors emanating from the food preparation areas, the convenient explanations for patron disappearances, the carnival's inexplicable ability to maintain abundant supplies despite regional shortages, all had generated private discussions among those responsible for community welfare. But rather than investigating these concerns or demanding answers from carnival management, the town's leadership had chosen willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth. The carnival's economic contribution was too valuable, its entertainment too essential for community morale, its food too extraordinarily satisfying to risk losing through excessive scrutiny. They had suspected the worst and decided that some secrets were preferable to the consequences of knowledge. What made this complicity particularly chilling was its rational foundation. The missing persons were invariably outsiders, drifters whose disappearance generated minimal social disruption. In exchange for turning blind eyes to these vanishings, the community received economic prosperity, unprecedented culinary pleasure, and a social gathering place that had become central to their collective identity. From a purely utilitarian perspective, the trade seemed almost defensible. Thorne's final interview, conducted with Old Man Heston, whose persistent questions had initiated the investigation, revealed the ultimate horror underlying the community's reaction. When asked about his grandson's fate, Heston admitted that grief over Simple Jack's death was complicated by memories of the extraordinary meals they had shared at the carnival. He could not separate mourning for his lost family member from longing for the flavors that had made those final evenings together so memorable. The carnival had achieved something far more insidious than simple murder. It had created a community of unknowing cannibals whose appetites had been permanently altered by their consumption of human flesh disguised as conventional cuisine. The residents of Proctor's Folly had not merely witnessed cannibalism, they had enthusiastically participated in it, and their bodies remembered what their minds preferred to forget. But if that revelation disturbs you, wait until you hear what happened next. Make sure you're subscribed because the aftermath reveals how communities protect themselves from truths too horrifying to acknowledge. The carnival was gone, its proprietors fled or dead, but the hunger it had cultivated would prove far more difficult to extinguish than the flames that had consumed its physical manifestation. The official record of the carnival incident was sanitized with surgical precision by authorities who understood that certain truths were too dangerous for public consumption. Within days of the fire, a coordinated effort emerged to reshape the narrative into something the community could live with, transforming systematic cannibalism into a more palatable tale of isolated madness and tragic accident. The coroner's inquest for Silas Marlowe became a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Despite the absence of any identifiable remains and multiple witness accounts of his escape into the prairie, the official finding declared him dead by fire. The coroner's signature appeared as a shaky X rather than a name, suggesting either illiteracy or deliberate anonymity that would make future challenges to the verdict difficult to pursue. Malcolm Henderson received posthumous designation as the sole perpetrator of the carnival's crimes, a lone madman whose descent into cannibalistic violence had culminated in the destruction that consumed the enterprise. This narrative required ignoring substantial evidence of systematic operation and organizational complicity, but it provided the psychological comfort of attributing incomprehensible evil to individual pathology rather than collective moral failure. Dr. Hargrave and the surviving carnival employees simply vanished, their dispersal so complete it suggested coordination rather than panic. Some witnesses reported seeing wagons departing in different directions during the fire's confusion, but no official effort was made to track these fugitives or recover the documentation they carried. The ledgers that contained evidence of hundreds of murders were never recovered, their contents existing only in Deputy Thorne's memory and unofficial notes. Town council meetings held in the weeks following the incident focused exclusively on damage control and reputation management. The official minutes, carefully preserved in municipal archives, record votes to move forward constructively and avoid dwelling on unsubstantiated allegations that serve no productive purpose. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. The community would actively suppress any discussion that might attract outside investigation or damage the town's prospects for economic recovery. Reverend Hemlock's final sermon, delivered on October 31st to a congregation still reeling from recent revelations, proved prophetic in ways that made his sudden departure from the community seem less like coincidence and more like self-preservation. His warnings about gluttony that consumes the soul itself took on new meaning in light of the townspeople's disturbing reactions to the carnival's destruction. Within a week of delivering these remarks, Hemlock had relocated to a distant parish, citing health concerns that prevented him from continuing his ministry in Proctor's Folly. The town's newspaper, the Proctor's Folly Gazette, ceased publication entirely rather than risk covering the story that had consumed their community. The final edition contained only agricultural reports and weather observations, avoiding any mention of the events that had transformed their world. The printing press was sold to a neighboring town, effectively ending the only local record of contemporary events. Most tellingly, the site where the carnival had operated was treated not as a crime scene requiring investigation, but as a location to be avoided and forgotten. No official excavation was conducted, despite obvious evidence that human remains might be recovered from the ashes. Instead, the area was allowed to return to prairie grass, with local authorities discouraging curiosity seekers and researchers who might disturb the peace that had been so carefully constructed. The conspiracy of silence proved remarkably effective. Official records from surrounding counties contain no mention of the carnival incident beyond routine fire reports that attributed the blaze to accidental causes related to cooking equipment. Federal authorities, if they ever learned of the allegations, chose not to investigate claims that would have required resources they were unwilling to commit to crimes in remote agricultural areas. The record was sealed through collective agreement rather than legal mandate. But the legend that grew from this enforced amnesia and the memory of that extraordinary flavor began to fester in the shadows where official history refused to acknowledge its existence. More than a century has passed since the carnival's destruction, yet the legend of Marlowe's savory salt refuses to die. What began as a suppressed local scandal has evolved into a grotesque form of dark tourism, attracting researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and individuals whose interest in the story extends far beyond academic curiosity. Modern carnival historians, a surprisingly large community of amateur researchers dedicated to documenting traveling entertainment history, have made the Marlowe case their obsessive focus. Online forums dedicated to the subject contain hundreds of posts analyzing surviving documentation, speculating about the carnival's actual route, and most disturbingly, attempting to reverse engineer the original seasoning recipe based on witness testimonies and period cooking techniques. These digital detectives have compiled extensive databases of missing persons reports from the 1880s and 90s, cross-referencing disappearances with documented carnival appearances across the Midwest. Their work has revealed patterns that extend far beyond the 3 counties originally investigated by Deputy Thorne, suggesting the carnival's activities may have spanned a much larger geographic area and claimed significantly more victims than official records acknowledged. The most troubling aspect of this modern fascination lies not in historical research, but in practical application. Reports have surfaced of copycat food vendors appearing at county fairs and regional festivals, their menus featuring unusual spice blends that allegedly recreate the carnival's legendary flavors. Health Department investigations of these operations have documented multiple instances of food poisoning and unexplained illness among patrons, though no definitive connection to criminal activity has been established. One particularly disturbing case involved a food truck operator in Kansas who claimed to possess documentation inherited from a carnival employee ancestor. The truck's logo bore suspicious similarities to period illustrations of Marlowe's enterprise, and health inspectors noted an unusual quantity of salt-based seasonings that the operator refused to identify, beyond claiming they were traditional family recipes. The operation was shut down after 17 customers required hospitalization following consumption of their signature roasted meat dishes. The physical site where Marlowe's carnival met its end has become an unlikely pilgrimage destination for those drawn to locations associated with historical violence. The coordinates have been shared extensively on social media platforms dedicated to dark tourism, despite efforts by local authorities to discourage visitation. The area itself defies natural explanation, a barren patch of earth where vegetation refuses to grow despite the fertility of surrounding farmland. Visitors to the site report a persistent odor that intensifies during evening hours, a complex mixture of wood smoke and cooking meat that seems to emanate from the soil itself rather than any identifiable source. Wind patterns in the immediate area behave strangely, often carrying scents and sounds that have no apparent origin. Local residents have learned to avoid the location entirely, particularly during autumn months when the sensory phenomena reach their most intense levels. Perhaps most unnervingly, several individuals who have visited the site have subsequently reported profound changes in their dietary preferences and cooking habits. These visitors describe developing powerful cravings for heavily seasoned meat dishes, experimenting with spice combinations in attempts to recreate flavors they insist they have never actually tasted. Support groups have formed online for people struggling with what they describe as carnival syndrome, though no medical professionals have validated this self-diagnosed condition. The story's persistence in popular culture speaks to something deeper than mere historical curiosity. Documentary filmmakers, podcast hosts, and true crime authors continue to revisit the case despite the scarcity of verified evidence, suggesting that the tale satisfies psychological needs that transcend factual accuracy. The narrative of a community unknowingly participating in cannibalism resonates with contemporary anxieties about consumer culture, corporate deception, and the uncomfortable truth that many modern conveniences exist because we choose not to examine their origins too closely. The story refuses to die because the appetite it describes transcends its historical context, representing timeless questions about complicity, consumption, and the prices we are willing to pay for pleasures we prefer not to understand. The legend of Marlowe's Carnival forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of complicity and consumption that extend far beyond a single historical incident. While we cannot verify every detail of the testimony that has survived, the documented disappearances remain undeniably real, recorded in municipal records that no amount of official suppression could completely erase. What makes this story particularly chilling is not the existence of monsters like Silas Marlowe and Malcolm Henderson, individuals whose capacity for evil we can dismiss as aberrant pathology. The true horror lies in the revelation that ordinary people, when presented with extraordinary pleasure, will rationalize participation in activities they would normally find abhorrent. The residents of Proctor's Folly were not inherently evil, yet they became willing accomplices in systematic cannibalism because the benefits outweighed their moral reservations. This pattern repeats throughout history and forms both subtle and overt. Communities that benefit from industries built on exploitation, consumers who prefer ignorance about the origins of their conveniences, societies that maintain comfortable lifestyles through systems they choose not to examine too closely. The carnival's genius lay not in hiding its crimes, but in making them palatable through careful presentation and addictive reward. The most disturbing lesson of Marlowe's enterprise is how easily appetite can override ethics when the seasoning is applied with sufficient skill. The right combination of necessity, pleasure, and willful ignorance can make any atrocity digestible, transforming participants into collaborators who genuinely believe they are victims rather than accomplices. Perhaps the story's enduring fascination stems from recognition that we all participate in systems whose full implications we prefer not to understand. The distance between our dinner tables and the carnival's serving line may be shorter than we care to acknowledge. If you find yourself questioning your own capacity for such complicity, you're engaging with exactly the kind of moral examination that these dark chapters of history demand. Subscribe to explore more stories that reveal the uncomfortable truths about human nature that polite society prefers to keep buried.